Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Tracy Cleaton. I'm the Director of IT for Saga Communication, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation on security awareness. We're taking some time today to talk about this topic. We're going to try to have a little bit of fun with our presentation, but the topic is very real. Security is in the news, magazines, TV. You can't pick up anything that talks about current events that doesn't talk about security threats, both physical attacks or cyber attacks, lost data, lost information. It's prominently in the news today. Globally, we're spending about $400 billion a year on lost records. To try to combat that, companies today are spending around $77 billion a year. We're going to be spending $170 billion a year by the year 2020 to protect that, all to prevent about 1 million new attacks per day that are being released. Saga looks at security based on our network environment. We've got a model where we handle that internally and how the IT team battles the threats. Saga's IT team is rapidly trying to handle the threats that are out there. We're in the process of deploying a web filtering tool that will block malicious malware while it's in transit. It'll also prevent our systems from talking back and passing data to known threats. We just recently finished a third-party assessment. They went through and scanned our network for vulnerabilities, and we're taking corrective actions for the items that it found. In the third quarter of this year, we'll be deploying a new antivirus product, and that's a next generation product that finally takes care of and addresses some of the concerns with crypto lockers and advanced threats. Doing new network segmentation, this has been some of the things that you've seen with changes in how you access the automation network and where you have access. It's limited some of your access and changed where you have to be to do those things, but it is preventing a lot of threats from being able to take us off the air. And we're actively reducing user access to unnecessary areas of the system. This prevents systems from using your access to take advantage and compromise Saga's data. While IT is actively addressing these concerns, the biggest threat remains our users. This is you, this is me, this is any of us that uses the systems interactively. While we're surfing the web and while we're accessing the information, we remain the biggest threats. We can only go so far with the technology. The users are really the last key, and that's why we're having this presentation today. With that, I'd like to introduce Mary Yeoman. She's been doing some training with Saga for several months now. She works for ITA Group. She's a professional trainer. She's been doing security awareness training now for 10 years. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Tracy. So looking at security awareness, we have many steps that we've taken over time. So looking back even 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we've changed a lot of how we've been able to overcome different types of security risks. So we've become aware, we've recognized obviously that there's a risk, and then going into a little bit more understanding, become a little bit more committed, and hopefully have a positive outcome. Because the last thing that we want is to make things difficult, right? So what we're trying to do is look at those risks and identify those issues. So looking back at, back even a few years back when credit cards were just still printed on receipts and things like that, we've masked information. Driver's license numbers still had your social security number on it, things like that. So there's different types of things that we've done over time to change up how we identify these risks and solve them, and hopefully, again, have a positive outcome in the end. So of course, over time, we've had all these different excuses of different things. So my favorite one, I should say, is the one is, well, I don't use technology, I don't have to worry about it. But it's not always the technology that we have to worry about. It's about, the piece of paper that might have bank information that's on your desk at home or your countertop, or things like that. Or, oh, I have my wireless that's protected at home, so I don't have to worry about what I click on the internet. Well, it doesn't really have to do with that. There's other things that go along with what we're doing out there. So there's other different risks, financial, and making sure you lock your car, and even your house. Some small towns, it's like, I live in a small town, I don't need to lock my house. I have a big dog. That's what I hear a lot about. I have a big dog. Our dog would welcome you in the house. Give me a treat, it's all good. So, with that, we implement all these different systems. But as Tracy mentioned, the human element is huge here. So we can have all the different types of encryption, antivirus, and all those kinds of things in here. I love this cartoon. And of course, there's Dave that comes in here and messes it up. So let's take a look at 3 different categories of different types of security awareness components. CIA, as it's identified. So confidentiality is more of, that's a common term that we normally hear more about. It's confidential information. We need to keep it safe and secure. It might be sales information, social security numbers, employee data, things like those kinds of things. The integrity is more about data that we're working with and how we're keeping the accuracy of it, how we're keeping data free. So if there happens to be a compromise or something with that information, how do we know that it's still trustworthy? How do we still work with that information? And then the accessibility, that's how we access that information through different means, passwords, different sites, different sources and systems. And then Tracy's going to go into a little bit more on each of those.
Saga looks at the confidentiality in terms of our data. Know where the data that you have access to resides and where it should be stored. Your engineer, your IT person can help you with understanding this. Business manager, if you're accessing accounting data. Don't share your usernames and passwords. Even for a quick, convenient task that somebody else might be able to perform, giving somebody your username and password compromises all of the data that you have access to that another user might not be authorized to access. They can access your email, they can send stuff on your behalf. It's just a threat that's not worth entering into. If you have data that you're unsure of where it should be or how it should be secured, ask. This is the best way for us to be able to ensure that we have a place for all of the data and that it's securely configured with limited access of who needs it. Integrity. Again, don't share your usernames, passwords. It ensures that the data is entered that you created and that it's maintained and that its integrity isn't compromised. Don't enter, write, say, or express anything that isn't true. Just keep it simple, and it ensures that the data keeps its integrity. Accessibility. Don't store information on your computer. The data belongs on our network, in the network shares that we create. These are where we can back it up. These are where we can restore from. These are where we can address compromises the best. If you store the data on your computer and your computer crashes, your data is gone. You lose your accessibility to the data. You lose the ability for IT to be involved in helping you recover it. And keep in mind portable devices. We all have cell phones, smartphones. We all have our emails on devices. We put files on USB sticks, and we transport information quite regularly in our daily lives. All of that stuff becomes a threat when it's lost. We'll be getting into that in a little bit more detail as we progress through the presentation. With that, I'll turn it back to Mary.
The domain triad is an interesting way of looking at the different types of risks when it comes to security. They break it down into cyber, physical, and people. So looking at the different categories, there's different risks, but each individually, the risks are not much of a risk in there. So a password, for example, if I were to say, here's a password, we don't know if it's my banking password or my Facebook password or email or things like that. But once you get the people element involved, that's when the risk happens. They can then take that password and then potentially do something with it. Take something under the physical, like dumpster diving. I can throw a piece of paper in the garbage, but it takes that human element, that person, to make that actually a security risk. So it's interesting when they can actually all 3 be combined as well. So individually, they're not much of a risk, but when they're combined together, that's when that security risk is more prevalent. So looking at the human firewall, it's kind of an interesting twist on things. We're the security risk typically, but we can also become a human firewall. So we're the ones that actually report the risk because we understand that the technology can't always do things. They don't always recognize those things. We're the ones that help update that information and recognize those risks in there. And then there's also principle of least privilege, which identifies how you have access to the information. So when you start with the organization, you're given information or given rights to be able to get into certain folders and access and things like that. And over time that may change a little bit. So you might change positions, get more access, but we're not going to give you everything. We're only going to give you what you need. So that principle of least privilege is going to give you that particular access. Then there's, of course, approved file sharing methods and then file encryption and things like that that we can do in order to protect our information. And then of course going into how to protect information from digital and physical form.
I really like Mary's concept of the human firewall. At Saga, we're looking for you guys to be that point of stopping of a threat. If you see a threat, if you have a concern, if you're seeing something unnatural behavior on your computer, contact me, contact your regional IT manager, your engineer, and your business manager. Don't be afraid to sound an alert and to sound it loudly throughout the company to the number of people that need to know and can help deal with that. Contact the help desk, your regional manager, when you see weaknesses that we might be able to help ensure get closed. If you have data, again, that you're not sure where it belongs or how it should be contained, make sure that you're contacting us so that we can address that. One of the things that's going to kind of come across as counterintuitive to us in radio and TV is if you do see a threat that's happening, disconnect your internet. This is going to cause problems from production to sales, but it stops a lot of threats today. Encryption of files, that type of cryptolocker mechanisms that are in the wild today, by disconnecting the internet, you can actually slow down or stop those threats. You also protect the rest of the company, protect the rest of Saga from a threat that might be local in your market and in your environment. So don't be afraid to do that. Use company assets to store data. Saga engages with Microsoft 365, and we use OneDrive as a public place to store data. And again, always ask questions when you're in doubt of anything related to security. Some things not to do. Don't use Apple, Google, Dropbox, and other third-party tools to share data. You can use these if you're sharing one piece of data with one particular customer that requires that for their sharing of commercials or other information, but we don't use those tools as across-the-board assets in Saga. We use OneDrive as our standard solution. Don't share your access with other people. You're responsible for your password. You're responsible for the access that happens under that. With the web filtering that we're doing, we do keep track of websites that are accessed. And if that happens under your logon, you're responsible for that. So don't share your information. Make sure you lock your computer when you walk away from it. We do have screensavers that automatically lock out, but if you're moving around and leaving a computer for a period of time, make sure you lock it. Don't open attachments, don't click on links. If you're not expecting something from someone, don't access it. We're going to talk about this a little bit more further on in the presentation. But if you're not expecting an attachment, contact the person that sent it to you, ask them if it's legitimate. We're seeing a lot of threats coming through the systems that way, pretending to be somebody that's in the environment and that you would know and have contact with. Mary's going to talk about types of sensitive information.
So there's different types of sensitive information. We like to categorize them into personally identifiable information, or PII. This could be anything that could be used to identify anyone. So social security number, name, date of birth, sometimes it's maiden name information, things like that. So all of those pieces individually are really not much of a risk. So take a date of birth. There's lots of people that share a birthday and things like that. So, but when you add a name to it or a social security number, that's when the risk is obviously higher. And then look at something like if you've ever Googled yourself. That's very interesting. If you've ever gone out and Googled yourself, see where you are out on the internet, and where you're at as far as LinkedIn and Facebook and things like that. It might surprise yourself on where you're actually out there, and it might be something to think about later. Of where you actually really want to be or things like that. So again, putting yourself out there a little too much may be a little bit more of a risk there too. Tracy's going to continue talking about sensitive information.
Most of us at Saga come in contact with some portion of the private sensitive information, whether it's sales orders, employee data, Arbitron contract information. All of us have some aspect of that. What I want us to start doing is when we come across that contact and when we're interacting with data that's sensitive, is just to have in mind a yellow light. This is caution. We need to be careful of what we're doing with this, where we're sending it, who we're giving it to, and how we're accessing it. If you keep that in mind as you're accessing the data, you'll become that human firewall that we're looking for.
So let's switch gears just a little bit, looking at the physical threats of security. One of the things mentioned earlier by Tracy were thumb drives and the risk that they have with those. Even though they're very handy to have in a pinch to be able to quickly transfer information from one system to another, they are a huge risk. They're small, they're easily lost. We just want to make sure that we're not storing confidential information and using them in that method. And then there's also this term called road apples, which is kind of an interesting term, but thumb drives are actually planted in locations. So if we happen to find one on the ground, we're going to go home, we're going to plug them into our systems. Well, that's what they're counting on to be able to launch malicious programs and take over systems and things like that. So the biggest things with this is, what would you do if you found one? You really shouldn't be doing anything with plugging it into a system, especially at work on the network, because you are putting that at risk. So, contact IT, get it to someone there, and then they can take a look and see how they're going to put that information or see what information's on that thumb drive. So looking at different types of physical threats of security, obviously we want to make sure if we're building security that we're not having anybody that's not supposed to be in the building kind of walk in with you. Maybe they're unfamiliar, they're not knowing where they're supposed to go, things like that. They may need to be escorted to the proper locations, the front desk, those kinds of things. Being aware of where you're storing information. So is it a public drive? Is there something that shouldn't be shared with everyone? Confidential information. The clean desk idea. I always kind of laugh at this one because people are like, well, if I have to clean my desk every day. Well, I'm not talking about getting out the paper towels and the spray and that kind of stuff, but just make it less appetizing for anybody that happens to walk by your desk to be like, oh, what's this? Things like that. Just keep it out of sight, out of mind, those kinds of things. Keeping those confidential information pieces locked up, kind of like I mentioned earlier. How would you know if there's some information that might be taken off of that? And the reason I say taken in this way is it's not physically taken. There's so many different ways to be able to acquire information. It doesn't have to be physically taken off your desk. We all have mobile devices that have a camera on them anymore. And it's just a quick picture, and then you can move on. So it's very high risk to have just something sitting out on your desk. So looking at this, of course, we're talking about different types of theft as well. So you look at work, Tracy mentioned earlier about locking your screen before you leave your desk. That's a big one. Making sure that that is just the initial piece to lock everything down. Making sure, if you're printing something, you're going to a common area that might have a printer or copier, that you're not just printing and leaving it there that might potentially have confidential information sitting there. And then just, again, quick sweep of your desk, what's left out in plain sight. You might not want to have a binder on your desk that says client information or sales data or something like that. That's obviously a key point with that. As you're traveling, that's a huge one too. So as you're looking at the information that you might be working on, say you're sitting at the airport, you've got your laptop open, who might be sitting around you and looking at that, keeping your information with you, laptops and things like that. Destroying confidential information, so using shredders and things like that, putting it in the proper locations to make sure it's disposed of properly. And then looking at personal items that are on your desk too. Are they just appetizing for someone to walk by and, oh, that looks cool, or those kinds of things? You don't always think about that stuff, even though we have gizmos and gadgets and things like that. Would it be appetizing for someone to look at those? And then look at home. We kind of look more at the work side of things, but think of what's at your house. What's on the kitchen counter? You just got the mail and you have a credit card bill, or your mortgage papers, or some sort of certification or something like that that you might have out there that might be interesting to others. Do you have a shredder at home? Might that be something you might invest in? And then mobile devices as well. You've got all those kinds of things that you might be traveling with email and things like that. Obviously, passwords are going to be great to have on mobile devices. That should be a given for that. And anytime that you might be trading up information or trading up phones, things like that, I don't always trust the people that are at the cellular locations to say, yeah, we'll take care of that for you. I'll want to do it myself and then pass it on to them, because that way I know it's going to be done.
We often talk about the fact that data is never lost. It's always multiple places. It's true until you need it. And then in that case, sometimes it has been deleted. Something that people often forget about if they're getting rid of devices, if they're getting rid of copiers, if they're getting rid of cell phones, if they're getting rid of USB drives, if they're getting rid of hard drives, if they're destroying computers. Those computers contain tons of information. Copiers today come with 20, 40 gig hard drives. They just continually cycle each image of everything that's been copied. You can often go to the junkyard, pick up a copier. You can have 20 years of photocopies from a business. Make sure that those pieces of equipment that you're getting rid of that contain any information or might contain information are being destroyed. Always report when you've lost your equipment to the IT department. We can wipe this stuff remotely. We can make phones unusable. We have quite a few options if you let us know that you've lost the data to prevent that data from getting in the hands of people that we don't want it in. Make sure that you're not afraid to pick up the phone and let us know that you've had a situation as soon as you're aware of it.
So moving into passwords. We love passwords, right? No, most of us don't love our passwords. But we have to make them hard to guess but easy to remember. And most of us are probably like, what does that even mean? You know, because we have to remember our passwords, so how do we make it hard but easy to remember? Use a paraphrase of some kind. You know, throw in a sentence. Maybe it's your favorite phrase. One of my passwords, not that I'm going to tell you what it is, it's about how much I love my password. I'm being sarcastic. But it's a way for me able to remember for this specific password in order to know what it is. So things like that. Change it up. One of the tricks that I use is you may have a similar password that you might want to have for similar things, but throw in some characters that might go along with that particular site. So if it's Facebook, maybe throw an FB in there. So that way you identify that that's the password for your Facebook account, but still have a pattern that you're using for specific sites, okay? Change them when they expire and change the ones that don't expire. Those are the ones where probably are not as likely to change. You're probably thinking, when was the last time I changed my Facebook password and things like that? But we have to be aware of that too. You know, we can't go years and years and years using the same passwords. We really do need to change them on a regular basis. At work, they're going to change for you. They do change every 90 days. So that'll be something that's a given, but we have to think more on the other sides of different types of passwords. They say to avoid words in the dictionary. Again, that's a hard one, but using those special characters, changing it up a little bit, making sure things are secure. Keeping in home and work passwords separate. That's a big one. If you happen to have one that's compromised for a personal reason, you're risking a work one or vice versa. So that's really hard there. Multiple logins, multiple passwords. We've already kind of talked about that already. And then the use of passwords on mobile devices. That's huge. Making sure that we are protecting our information. Even your phone's just sitting there, we need to have a password on that just in case. So let's jump into a different topic. Safe surfing and free Wi-Fi. So once we're out on the internet, we have to be aware of where we're going, and when we're out on those secure sites, they have to be make sure that they're an HTTP site. So when you're logging into your banking site and some other things that require passwords, make sure that those are on their secure sites. And then multiple passwords. We all have so many different passwords for different sites and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're using different passwords, even though that can be challenging for that. Try and make them different so that way you're not creating risk for yourself on having those same passwords. And then don't write your passwords down. Again, difficult, but try not to do that. Be aware of hotspots when you're at free Wi-Fi locations. So if you're at Starbucks and you're joining Starbucks Wi-Fi, it may be considered a hotspot for somebody because they've made it look like Starbucks, but you're actually potentially connecting to someone else's Wi-Fi, and they're tracking everything that you do. So looking at text messages, anything that you log into, so you log into your bank and you check your statement, they can track all those little key logs and things like that. So again, putting yourself at risk. Best course of action, especially working with work information, is connecting through VPN. You're going to create that secure spot for you to be able to connect through and be able to protect your information. Earlier we mentioned about shoulder surfing, so looking at where you're located and being able to understand your surroundings a little bit more. Is it a location that you might have some people walking by or that might be gazing over your shoulder? So try and put yourself in a position where you're not going to be having that kind of risk there too.
Saga is implementing a product called Zscaler that will interfere with bad content. It'll cut content that's coming into your computer that's determined to be malicious, and it'll prevent information that's if you have malware on your computer that's trying to send data to a destination in Russia or China or to an organized crime source, it'll stop that data from being sent. There is it's called a zero-day threat. That's the time period between the initial release of a threat and the detection and stopping of that threat. So nothing is 100%. Nothing is entirely going to stop these. These will stop threats shortly after they're released. Once they're determined to be done, they'll cut off that data from both sides. They'll cut off the incoming threat of malicious software that's designed to compromise your system, and they'll prevent the loss of data from reaching its destination once your computer system has been cut. But again, there's a period of time where those threats are real and still our systems are vulnerable to them, and that's where you come into the fold as to being the human firewall and going to sites and using sites that are appropriate and that don't contain malicious malware.
So the cloud is something that most of us should be fairly familiar with, but there's some of us that are still getting used to the idea of what the cloud is, how it's used, where it is, all that kind of stuff. So we really probably don't realize a whole lot, or at least most of us don't, that we work in the cloud a lot. Whether it's work, personal, whatever the case is, what we're doing every day, there's a good portion of what we do that is out in the cloud. If you're sending a text message, if you're sending things via email, if you're shopping online, you're using mobile devices, you're watching a YouTube video, whatever the case is, you're using the cloud. And the other thing that you need to remember about that, it's probably the biggest thing, when you store things out there, if you save a Facebook picture out on your account, yes, it's on your account, but it's really not yours. It's out there on a whole bunch of different servers that replicate and things like that. And with that replication, we mentioned earlier that deleting things is something that is really hard to do. So if you mistakenly post something or say the wrong thing or whatever the case is, it's really not deleted because of that replication. It could be in many different places very quickly because of that. So let's move into social engineering. So this is a very common way of trying to get information from individuals. They act on your emotions. They try and get information as far as, an email message that looks like your bank that might be coming to you. And it looks like